All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Just to review, two blasts at an airport in Brussels shortly before 8 a.m. local time today. About an hour later, an explosion hit a train station. We have at least 30 people dead, over 200 injured. Belgium raised their terror threat, and Brussels went on lockdown. Three suspects. They had a picture of them. There they are. The two on our left are presumed dead, suicide, homicide bombers. The one on the right is still at large. Police raided a home in Brussels and found an ISIS flag, chemicals, nail bombs, which we believe were used in the attacks today. And the search goes on. We also have this late-breaking word from a local mayor in the proximity of the attack, who said the Belgium attackers' bombs were in their bags. We assumed that, but now I guess we know it. Also, the United States is saying that the bombings today in Brussels are connected to the Paris terror cell. Joining me now on the panel, we welcome in Jonathan T. Gilliam, former Navy SEAL and FBI agent, president of U.S. Continued Service, and the host of The Experts. And also joining us is Scott Uehlinger, retired CIA operations officer and national security and counterterrorism expert. Gentlemen, welcome. Jonathan, let me start with you and ask you about the, I guess what gets me again is the proximity of the attack to the arrest of the Paris ringleader or mastermind, and now the U.S. saying just a few minutes ago that there was a relationship between this attack and that Paris cell.
Does that even surprise you,
No,
Steve? You know,
no.
I'm talking to everybody. I talked to the makeup artist outside. Even she knew, and she's not a tactical expert. She knows that this is probably what caused this. I think that you know, Brussels has a real problem not only with terrorists harboring there, and I want to stop calling them terrorists. Terrorism is their tool. They're Islamic fundamentalists, and they are harboring them there. They do not take down the cells adequately. They wait until something happens before they do any type of investigation. At least that's what it appears from the point of view that we have. And then they go and arrest this guy, the most wanted terrorist in the world at the time, and they think that nothing is going to happen. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
Scott, you agree with the scenario put forth by Jonathan?
Absolutely. The Paris, a lot of the Parisian terrorists operated out of Brussels, and in fact, they got their weapons from that area. And Brussels, and specifically the one Malzberg, the one suburb, is a hotbed of Islamic activity. There's about 96,000 Muslims living in that area, most of them from North Africa. And this is where a lot of the people are coming from who are behind these terrorist acts. There also, a lot of them have seen combat in Syria, and this is another great problem that the Europeans have. As there are more and more Muslims becoming citizens in the European Union, many more of them are going to fight in Syria, gaining battle experience, and then, believe it or not, coming back and are sometimes only given cursory examination by the authorities as they return back to Belgium, to the Netherlands, to France, having murdered and shot up people in Syria and the Middle East.
All right, Scott, you're painting a doomsday scenario. I'll ask you if it's almost too late for much of Europe, and I'll ask you if we are headed in that direction.
That's a very interesting question. Unfortunately, my fear is for Europe, it really is too late. Their immigration policies since the 60s to make up for labor shortages, they've relied upon increasing the rate of Islamic immigration into their countries, and it's basically at critical mass now. The Belgian authorities have said they simply are overwhelmed. They cannot have literally every detective and every military intelligence specialist in the country has 10 Muslim extremist cases to pursue. That means no other cases are being pursued. The people are simply overwhelmed.
Jonathan?
And it's true in many other European countries, including in Great Britain.
Jonathan, so take it to here.
Right.
And where are we? Are we headed down this path without some major change? I'm not saying it's Donald Trump's proposal necessarily, but something along those lines.
The only thing that has protected us from falling into the same trap that they fall in over in Europe is the fact that logistically it's just harder to get the people and the equipment that they need, the explosives and the bullets and the guns, here into the United States. We have so many sources. Sources are our greatest asset, people who are inside, but those assets are being diminished because of the same political correctness that you see over in Europe. We stopped our surveillance like here in New York with the law enforcement, and that kills our ability to get more sources. We basically have to arrest people before we can flip them.
All right, we're going to come back, folks, with more from Jonathan and Scott here on the panel on this special edition here on Newsmax Television as we continue to talk about the Brussels terror attacks. And welcome back to our special coverage of the terror attacks in Brussels. I'm Steve Malzberg. Don't forget to tune in at 7 p.m. tonight Eastern Time to the Steve Malzberg Show. And we will talk more about this and have Bill Crystal and others talking more about the politics of it as well. Jonathan Gilliam and Scott Uehlinger rejoin me. And Jonathan, let me ask you about the Muslim community. We hear so much about we can't, from our president, that we can't do this and we can't do that, and we can't surveil, and he ended this program and that program, and we need to work with the Muslim community. And so if we can't offend them, because we can't, if we have these programs, they'll turn inside. Yet, from everything I hear from law enforcement and everything I read, there's hardly any instances of the Muslim communities turning in these bad guys before or after they are plotting or have committed these acts.
I think you just hit on the very thing that could stop all of this in an instant. Would be if the Islamic community stepped up to the plate and started turning these people over. But see, here's the problem. I've said this before and gotten condemned by certain people who just don't believe this way, but this is the truth. The more religious you get in Islam, the more likely, or at least the more susceptible you are to being recruited into fundamental Islam. We like to call it radical Islam in politics and on the news, but the reality is it's fundamental Islam. Until we admit that, and until Islam steps up to the plate, we're going to continue to have this problem. And I've been saying for a long time, if Islam doesn't step up to the plate, then Islam is going to have to suffer the consequences, and we're going to need politicians that are willing to step in to the Islamic community and find these people.
Exactly.
Well,
otherwise, they're going to continue.
Scott, let me ask you, from an international perspective, and certainly and for what you've described in Europe, that horrific scenario where it may be too late for Europe, doesn't seem like you got communities there turning in their bad guys either.
No, you don't. I'm in total agreement with what my colleague says. This is the elephant in the room that most people are simply afraid to address. And yes, absolutely, it's true in Europe. Abdus Salam, the gentleman who was the terrorist who was at large after the Paris attacks, he's been the most wanted man in Europe for something like 3 or 4 months. And he was hidden away in Brussels. He obviously has literally scores of Confederates who are willing to risk all to hide him. And that's the dirty little secret. He did not manage to hide, the biggest dragnet in Europe for 4 months on his own. He is not a lone wolf. He has a lot of help.
All right, gentlemen, this just in, seriously, I'm not trying to be funny here or flippant. President Obama, and I'll add this part, I guess between innings of the baseball game that he's watching in Cuba, decided to order flags to be flown at half-staff here in the United States, I presume, until March 26th, in honor of the victims of Brussels. Let me ask you both, Jonathan, start with you. How important is the message from the President of the United States when there is no message, when after this slaughter, he spends 50 seconds almost annoyed that he has to address it, doesn't mention radical Islam, doesn't mention who did it, doesn't have any solutions, no anger in his voice or on his face. How does that affect the landscape going forward?
Well, I mean, I think Brussels should, or Belgium should consider themselves lucky because he does none of that when a terrorist attack happens here in the United States. You don't see flags flown at half-mast. You don't see apologies or anything like that. It's normally cast over to something, anything but terrorism. I think, listen, it's no secret that our president and the administration is full of a bunch of people that are inexperienced in operational capacities. They don't know what they're doing. And as I've said on this show before, we are measuring the size of their mistakes rather than the minute details of their success. And this is a good example of
Scott,
that.
just like Bill Clinton bragged about turning down Osama bin Laden, I couldn't go after him because if I killed a couple of hundred civilians, I'd be like he was, so we didn't try to hit him. And then he wouldn't take him when I think Sudan wanted to hand him over because he wasn't under indictment. I mean, is this going to be, God forbid, a major attack here from ISIS one day? Are we going to look back at Obama and how he, denied that they existed, called them JV, now he called them like the Joker and Batman, and has done nothing?
There's no question that you're right. Until we have an administration change and maybe a breath of fresh air where people choose to see facts the way they are, not as they'd like to see them, this is going to continue to be a problem. I just wrote an article on this. People can look for it on the web. It's
Go ahead. You finish up, Scott. 30 seconds.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Basically, the more ideological an administration is, the more they want to stick with their narrative, and they don't want to hear anything that makes them uncomfortable. And this administration is the most ideological of all.
Yeah, and I think it was Cheryl Atkinson.
Don't want to hear the truth.
Yeah, Cheryl Atkinson, who once told me on this show that Obama doesn't even look at intelligence that he doesn't want to hear
Makes
about.
them
Hey, guys,
uncomfortable.
thank you. Scott and Jonathan, thank you very much. Joe Connor, terrorism expert, anti-terrorism expert, joins us next. Don't go away.